welcome to this webinar launch of two new titles from the series Elements in Shakespeare and Performance. My name is Emily Hockley and I'm the commissioning editor for literature and theatre at Cambridge. Today we're delighted to be hearing from Christie Carson about her book Robert Lepage's Intercultural Encounters, and also from Richard Schoch about his book A Short History of Shakespeare in Performance, from the Restoration to the 21st Century, as well as from W.B. Worthen, who is series editor of Elements in Shakespeare Performance. Before we get started, there are just the usual housekeeping points. You've all joined in listen-only mode, but you can submit questions via the Q&A box throughout the session, both for Christie and Richard, and also if you have any questions about the series in more general terms, we can answer those. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session once we've heard from Bill, Richard and Christie, but do pop them into the chat throughout. And if you have any tech issues, then similarly do let us know and one of our team can help you out. If we run into problems, we'll message everyone and just restart the webinar. And after the session, a recording of the talk will be emailed to you along with a discount code on the print editions of Christie and Richard's books. I should also say that Elements are free online for a fortnight following their first publication, and Richard's was formally published just under 2 weeks ago, so there's still a few days to take advantage of that and check out his work. We'll drop a link into the chat for everyone, so you can have a read of it if you haven't already. But I'll hand over to Bill now, who's going to give a brief introduction to the series.
Great, thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. I guess you see us, but we don't see you. I just want to say a few things about this series, The Elements in Shakespeare and Performance. We've published close to a dozen titles so far. As you know, the titles run between 20 and 30,000 words, which we think is a terrific length for anyone who is either thinking about exploring a new project or perhaps, as is often the case, has a kind of sideline project, something that they're doing alongside maybe a larger project and they want it to be seen and read and responded to. One of the exciting things about the series is that it is published both in paper and online. Obviously, the online version doesn't have any limitations other than the costs of publishing for visual imagery. And we're really excited about the ways we've been able to incorporate those into the series of elements that we've done so far. But if you are the kind of person as I am, who also likes to receive an object in the hand, there are handsome small paperbacks that you would receive and that are for sale as well for your readers. The series is designed to take on any aspect of Shakespeare and performance. And indeed, today we have two good examples of one kind of range that we have. Richard's text, that would have to have it, Richard's text, which undertakes a short history of Shakespearean performance, witnesses the extent to which we are not only concerned with contemporary Shakespeare performance, but indeed with all aspects of performance across history and geography. Christie's element for today about Robert Lepage also shows how we are interested as well in contemporary performance, the work of individual companies, directors, even individual performances. We're not confined to theatrical production. We're interested in Shakespeare across all media of performance. And I guess you wouldn't be surprised to know that I'm also someone who thinks of textual Shakespeare as an aspect of the performance of Shakespeare. We're interested in Shakespeare across genres. We have some texts that are particularly interested in Shakespeare pedagogy. And we have a number of exciting elements lined up to come out over the next few years. One on viral Shakespeare, a word that's close to all our hearts at the moment, on transgender Shakespeare, on Shakespeare among military veterans, on Shakespeare and indigeneity. And these will, I think, complement well the works that we've seen so far, having to do with performance philosophy, Shakespeare and neoliberalism, and a wide variety of other subjects. We have recently published an excellent element on Shakespeare and race, and we do have a few lined up about global Shakespeare, post-colonial Shakespeare, and Shakespeare in a variety of theoretical and political contexts. If you're interested, possibly interested, have questions about how the series might work, please feel free to email me. The email will appear in the chat. And I'd be happy to correspond with you about how the process works. The last, and I think in a way most exciting aspect of the Element series is once we receive the final draft of your element, once it's gone through the review process, you've made some revisions, it's 12 weeks from acceptance to publication, which means that readers are able to get a sense of the kind of work you're doing quite quickly. Once the element has been completed. I think for me personally, this has a pretty exciting aspect of writing about contemporary performance. It's just possible to write about a performance that still lives in people's memories and might even still be on stage. So we're really excited about that aspect of the series as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. We're now going to hear from Richard and then from Christie. And then I'll come back on and take your questions. Excuse me, I got that backwards. Thank you, Richard. Christie first and then Richard. And then I will come back on. You can ask questions as we proceed, and I'll be sort of grouping them, and we'll take questions for both of our recent authors as well as to me about the series when we return. Okay, so now on to Christie.
Thank you. There was some debate whether we wanted to go macro to micro or micro to macro, but we're going to do mine first. And I wanted to say thank you both to Sergio, who you haven't seen, and Emily, who've organized this event, but also to William and to Emily for their very, very sure-handed guidance through this process. The reviewers were very helpful and I think really increased and improved my element along the way. So, but Emily suggested that I talk about the motivation for writing this. And I guess I've had a sort of niggling feeling about wanting to write about Lepage and Shakespeare for a very long time, since I did some work on his, well, as part of my PhD thesis. But it was actually just in the last couple of years that 3 different volumes came across my desk on his work. And it seemed to me that this was a good starting point. So first of all, Melissa Pohl's Robert Lepage's Scenographic Dramaturgy, the aesthetic signature work, was published in 2018. James Reynolds' Robert Lepage Ex Machina, Revolutions in Theatrical Space in 2019, and Karen Fricker's Robert Lepage's original stage productions, Making Theatre Global in 2020. Now, all 3 of those are coming out of a performance background and not a Shakespeare background. And so, again, that's one of the things that I really wanted to highlight. But the thing that finally pushed me over the edge, as it were, was when Peter Kerwin asked me to write a review of a production that was broadcast during lockdown. And I chose Coriolanus, produced at the Stratford Festival by and directed by Robert Lepage in 2018, which I managed to see live when I was visiting my parents in Canada, and then watched when I came back to the UK. It was available for 3 weeks in May of 2020. So the choice of production was motivated by partly wanting to finally have something that I could show Shakespeare scholars in the UK of Lepage's work, because again, his work travels around a lot, but it isn't always widely available. And one of the things that, as I say, stood out was that his work is really well known in performance circles. But when I speak to English speaking Shakespeareans, they either look at me a little bit quizzically, or they say, oh, of course, he's the man who did A Midsummer Night's Dream at the National Theatre in 1992. In the mud, or they might know the only other production that is well known is his Elsinore from 1995, in which he essentially played all the parts. It was a personal interaction with that particular play. So this element, as I say, returns to my PhD work, which was on intercultural theatre in English Canada, Quebec, and Scotland in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in that, I looked at 6 case studies, 2 of which examined Lepage's work, and 1 of which was a Shakespeare play, which was Romeo and Juliet, spelled Juliet with an E-T-T-E at the end, to denote the fact that it was a bilingual production co-produced with Shakespeare on the Saskatchewan and co-directed by Gordon MacColl. So they were Les Capulets, the Capulets, and the Montagues. And the Les Capulets were French-Canadian actors who were all rehearsed in Quebec. And then the Montagues rehearsed in English Canada, and then they came together and produced a production which was on a dirt road with guns and trucks and in a circus tent, and was a little bit like the Baz Luhrmann, but it took place in 1989, so it was a few years before. So all the critical work that I read in these 3 volumes, not one of them mentioned this production. And I found myself thinking again and again that somehow there was something key to it in this director's work. So Paul examines extant texts, but it looks at excludes the early career and only looks at 1 performance of Shakespeare, which was The Tempest. Reynolds looks at an overview of his practices from 1994 to 2018 and only glances at his Shakespeare work. And finally, Fricker puts her emphasis on the original pre-1994 work, but only examines original productions. So it seemed to me there was quite a big gap there for an analysis of his Shakespeare work particularly. But like these 3 authors, I wanted to look at the director's process, but also the context from which he was working. So my element has several aims. The first one was to see how we tackle critically a work of a director like Lepage, who is engaged with Shakespeare over a long period of time, over a 40-year period, but in a career that has spanned, he's worked with Cirque du Soleil, he's worked with Peter Gabriel, he's worked with the Metropolitan Opera. There aren't many Shakespearean directors that have done that. So again, one of the things I was trying to look at was the way in which we look at a director like that who reflects his own historical, political, artistic milieu, but at the same time, he has worked in all sorts of other areas. So how do you place that kind of director alongside other Shakespeare productions and see them within that context? Or do you put it along this director's other work, which is more what I'm trying to do here? So the second aim of this element, and it's something that's come up recently, is the idea of representation and responsibility. And this is something that Shakespeare in performance studies is addressing at the moment, I think, but it's circulated around Lepage's work for a long time. 2 productions which Lepage directed in the summer of 2018 were cancelled in a storm of controversy. One, which was called Slav, involved white actors dressed as African-American slaves, and they were singing spiritual songs. So, you can see why there was a problem there. The other one was called Kanata, and it aimed to present a retelling of the story of the Indigenous people of Canada, and again, without representation of that community. So there was an enormous media frenzy which erupted around that, and a very heated debate took place, both on the streets and online. And as I say, both of those performances were then canceled. Lepage saw this as censorship and suggested that his artistic freedom was being curtailed. But what I found fascinating was the fact that at the same time, there was, in fact, exactly that same summer, was the Coriolanus that I was looking at. And I'm going to show you the trailer for that production, because I wanted to think about why this was the case. So this is his recent work. Let's see if So looking at that, my review for Shakespeare Bulletin, I found myself getting a little bit sort of tangled up in the whole presentation of my own positionality and the implications of watching the show online that I'd previously seen in the theater. So what I wanted to do, and the lack of context somewhat, it disturbed me, and I wanted to fill in the gaps for anyone who wasn't there. But the result was a review that rather, I think probably spent almost too much time on the frame and not enough time on helping a future scholar know what actually took place on stage. But it occurred to me that what is a reviewer supposed to do if the film version is available? I think there was a time where we felt it was our job to make a record of that. But if the record is there, then what does the reviewer do? So the third question my element deals with is, again, does a critic need to understand the context of a work like Lepage's? Does it matter if his political aims are fulfilled, or if his work is read in a very different way outside the country than it is inside it? So again, the bigger question is, how does decontextualization happen in the online world? And if it does it matter? So as you could see, that this production dealt very much with racism and with a color-conscious casting policy. And what I wanted to think about was the fact that Lepage actually took many of the decisions for this production from a much earlier production that he developed in 1993 of Coriolan, which was produced in French. So in the same way that he went back and examined, an older approach, I also wanted to go back to my PhD, which also happened to be in 1993, and look at earlier ideas about inter, multi, trans, and cross-cultural theatrical experiments that explore meaning and ways of meaning, and think about how these topics have developed over time. So in doing that, I wanted to highlight the work of one particular scholar of color, and again, this came out of the review process, who wrote about the controversy surrounding Lepage's production as a means of exploring what he called the problem of anti-Blackness in Quebec. So in highlighting his work, I also realized that I'm in danger of repeating the mistake that Lepage makes of confusing empathy and representation. So the challenge that I set myself was to try to showcase the argument that Philip S.S. Howard makes without taking it as a means of saying, well, what he said, that's just the way I feel, sort of thing. So again, this raised questions for me. I thought if the lessons for theater practitioners are, as Paul actually said in another webinar on Lepage, there should be no discussion about us without us, then should theater and performance critics be held to the same standard? Who has the right to critique? I decided to look at Lepage's origins and trajectory from then to now, partly as a means of examining my own. So from the very first moment that Lepage arrived in the UK, he was seen to be compared, his work was seen to be compared with Peter Brooks. And that was one thing that I wanted to contest a little bit. I'm just gonna, oops. Something that, and so I wanted to look at another piece of another video, which enables you to see Michael Coveney describing him when he first arrived. But I think what's interesting about that is the fact that he was seen in a cultural light that was different than his own. Sorry. And I wondered if this misunderstanding, from my point of view, again, if it was something that mattered. So we'll just let you hear what he has to say.
Lepage has been accepted into the European community of theatre, I think, on the same level as other wunderkinds of the world, like Peter Sellars, who's based in Boston, and of course, Jan Faber, who's based in Antwerp. About the same age, early 30s, mid-30s. These seem to us, or to me, from where I sit, three of the most interesting directors in the world at the moment. And Robert Lepage is, in his own way, on their level. It's something quite strange about the whole thing. For Quebec, and the big connection, because you expect I think that it just shows us that maybe we're
So what I wanted to show, I mean, and again, this is one of the wonderful things, as Bill was saying about the elements, is that we can show audiovisual materials, and I have a couple of clips in my element as well, or at least links that you can see things. This shows Lepage very much as he arrived in the UK, as the Wonderkind, as he was described by Michael Coveney. And I wanted to contrast that with the vision of his work as it was seen within Canada, and to highlight how much he is a product of his environment. So having followed his career for more than 35 years, I wanted to show the sort of several faces of the person that Michael Billington called a theatrical magician. So I'm just going to go to the very earliest production that he did, called Circulation, with Théâtre Lepage. And again, as you can see, it's 36 years ago. So.
Is the lead actor, the creator of Circulation. He's typical of the new generation of French who have almost a tongue of speaking English. People have an impression that they have to say something or to, you know, they have to do something about it. Like the new generation, I think we have to save the language that we used to do. I mean, the theater and the music and the poets, the records have that kind of mandate, you know, to save the language. But I think it's strong enough now.
Christie?
Yeah.
No one is getting the video on this.
They're not getting the video.
We're just getting the audio.
Okay. That's okay. Sorry about that.
Frontier between the French and the English. That's why I like. C'est comme ça.
No?
Yes, that was good. Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Ça se mêlait bien ensemble, je vois pas de différence. Pendant la pièce, là, tu sais, c'est comme si c'était la même langue.
They play the way we live. I mean, I work in English, I live in French, so I mean, I speak to her in English, I speak to her in French. I would come to see a play, and they do the same thing.
You don't feel threatened at all by
this?
Why not?
Because I'm sure what I am, and I am French.
Okay. Sorry, I'll stop sharing. So I'm not sure how much of that you saw, but we did get a sense of the linguistic play. But what I do in the element is go back to that early period and then map out his work with the Ligue Nationale d'Improvisation, which is a bit version of the National Hockey League, but with theater improvisation. But also his early successes with the Circulation and Vinci, which was about the life of Leonardo da Vinci. And all of them tackle the idea of identity and language as a part of that. But the most striking and popular earlier production was a touring production that he did called the Dragons Trilogy, which discussed the history of the Asian immigrant community in Canada, but it involved white actors playing the Asian characters. So while this was seen by the company as a form of flattery and empathy at the time, and it was also seen within Canada as an analogy of the position of the French Canadians within the larger English Canadian community, it's the same technique when used in the 21st century has ended in disaster. So Lepage indicated in 2018 that he was shocked by the response that his work received, But I wanted to point out that his approach has not really changed, but what has changed is the acceptance of this kind of way of dealing with intercultural issues. So I was surprised and pleased, I suppose, to discover that Peter Kerwin's own review of Coriolanus, which he did for a special edition of Shakespeare, Race and Nation in the journal Shakespeare, it does a much better job of describing what actually took place on stage. And I hope if he's watching, he won't mind that I actually am going to read out a little bit of it, but I want to do that in conjunction with showing you just one image. If I can find it. Okay, that's not working. Okay, I won't show you the image. But he says, despite the production's ideas, however, its casual treatment of Marius's murder has a sour taste. Its sense of the disposability of Marius feels deliberately pointed. As Phidias challenges and wrestles with Marius, calling him boy, his lieutenant, Johannes Sousa, steps up and shoots Marius at point-blank range in the back of the head. The resonances with the murders in the context of civil unrest are unavoidable. Phidias baiting Marcius into a performance of violence that serves as pretext for a summary execution. And then he concludes by saying, as clever as a production in technical terms as it might be, its heart and politics are in the final reckoning in the wrong place. So the image I was going to show you was actually of his production of Coriolan in 1993, which shows exactly that moment of Coriolanus being shot in the back of the head. So it's not a new production choice, but what happened by placing that same production choice within the context of a Black Lives Matter production, it gave it an entirely new meaning. So again, both Robert Lepage and myself are going back to 1993. And what I wanted to see was what would happen. And what it seemed to me that a new audience will always see things in a different way. Context is both personal and interacts with what is being presented on the stage. So what I do is take the reader through a short history of the difference between the way that theatre is created in Quebec and in English Canada, and use the production process of the Dragons Trilogy as an example of the way that Lepage works with members of his own community. This is then contrasted with the experience of working with the co-production of Romeo and Juliet with the Saskatchewan Company. While the production was well received by audience, it was disliked by critics, and eventually the show caused a rift between the two directors involved. And in fact, many of the French-Canadian actors knew so little English and had never been out of Quebec, they actually had to learn their parts phonetically. So what it showed was that interculturalism in theory is much more manageable than it can be in practice. My conclusion then is that Lepage has not changed the way that he works and has not really listened to the criticism of his politics of presentation. The result is the sort of response he received in 2018. His new theatre in Quebec, which is called Le Diamant, has not been able to operate during the pandemic, and perhaps being building bound is as unproductive for the future of theatre as being attached to old visions of universalism. Lepage has promised to do better, but it will be interesting to see what that means in real terms. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Richard now.
Thanks, Christie. And thanks to everybody for being here today. I'd like to thank Bill Worthen and Emily Hockley for publishing this text. And I'd especially like to thank two of my mentors for being in the audience today, Stephen Orgel and Stanley Wells, two legendary Shakespeare scholars. And it's an honor to have you both with us today. So the question we've been asked to address at the top is, why did we want to write this book? What was the motivation? And I really wanted a text for my students who are not usually taught about the history of Shakespeare on the stage. I was looking for a text to help them get their bearings in this field. And it turned out that this text did not exist. So me being an arrogant academic thought, well, I'm gonna just have to write it myself. So I did. Now it's crazy to write a book on the history of Shakespeare on the stage from the Restoration to the 21st century. And I thought, well, either this book needs to be 25,000 words or 25 volumes. But who has time for 25 volumes? 25,000 words will have to do. But you need to know exactly what you can do in 25,000 words and what you cannot do. What you can do is provide points of entry into that history, tools of navigation for scholars, students, and theater practitioners. So I haven't even tried to give a factual survey of Shakespearean performance, one production creeping after another until the last syllable of recorded time. Rather, I've tried to present ways of thinking about Shakespeare's afterlife so that it can become intelligible and more meaningful. So when you read this text, I encourage you to focus less on the specific performances that are being discussed and more on the issues of wider and lasting relevance that those performances put into play. So the book isn't really a retrospective summation. It's a prospective invitation for readers to undertake their own investigation of Shakespearean performance, whether for scholars wanting to situate themselves in a dynamic research field, or students or theater practitioners who might never have considered how previous generations staged Shakespeare or how other cultures do so now. So my hope, my goal for this book is not to end discussion, but to stimulate discussion. And I think discussion can be stimulated by encouraging certain habits of mind, to use a very old-fashioned phrase. And I'm thinking of two. The first, be historicist. We must make sense of past performances on their terms and not our terms. We must understand performances, past performances, in light of the values and desires of the artists who created them and the audiences who witnessed them, because their values are likely to be very different from ours. Habit of mind number two. Efficacy, yes. Evaluation, no. If we understand past performances on their terms, then it's much easier to appreciate the efficacy of those performances, not whether they were good or bad, who is to say, but why was a given performance created in a particular way, at a particular time, in a particular place, and for a particular audience? What cultural need did that performance respond to? What societal wound did that production try to heal? What difference did it make in the wider world? To me, these are the sort of questions we should bring to the history of Shakespeare on the stage. So there's a lot of material in the book, right? So important question about how to organize it. So I decided to split the difference, and part of the book is chronological and part of the book is thematic. So the first part of the book is chronological, from the Restoration, 1660 to about 1900. And this is chronological because the material is more or less restricted to Britain and North America, to key theatrical figures who advanced or transformed Shakespearean performance, and to productions in which even the most imaginative stage designs were nevertheless constrained by the limits of the traditional proscenium theater and by the limits of having to create theater without, for the most part, electricity and mechanization. And maybe even more importantly, this material is less well known, sometimes much less well known than contemporary performances. So I felt an obligation here to tell the story chronologically. So that's up to 1900. After 1900, the book becomes thematic for a couple of reasons. First, there's just so much more material. It's more profuse because Shakespeare then becomes a truly global icon, resulting in theatrical appropriations of his plays in divergent aesthetic formats and in multicultural, and as Christie has just shown us, intercultural settings. So some of the themes that arise and recur in the second half of the book are the role of the stage director, translations and Anglophone adaptations, changes in visual style and scenic environment, changes in styles of acting and speaking, outdoor Shakespeare, immersive Shakespeare, Shakespeare festivals and theater companies, dynamics of gender, race, and inclusivity in performance, and global, multicultural, and intercultural Shakespeare. There's a lot of material, and I've tried my best to make some sense of it. I want to elaborate a bit on three aspects that I think are brought out, that are put in relief in the book. Three aspects of Shakespeare performance history. One, history always leaves a trace, but it isn't always obvious. Two, adapting Shakespeare is the norm, not the exception. Three, because Shakespeare is familiar, Shakespeare can be strange. First point, history always leaves a trace, but it isn't always obvious. In the middle of the 19th century, there was an Anglo-French actor named Charles Fechter, and he took London by storm when he played Hamlet as a friendly, blonde-haired Danish prince. Spectators who arrived night after night at the Princess's Theatre wanted to see this new sort of Shakespearean tragic hero, neither the brooding aristocratic Hamlet embodied by John Philip Kemble at the beginning of the century, nor the sedate bourgeois Hamlet conveyed by Charles Keene in the 1840s and 50s. But here instead, with Fechter, was a thoroughly human Hamlet, as one of the London newspapers put it. When this Hamlet put his arm around his childhood friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, perched on a gravestone, sat on the ground with the gravediggers, and almost kissed Yorick's freshly unearthed skull. Startling behavior, never before seen by a London audience. Many felt that the greatest role in the Shakespearean repertoire had new life breathed into it at the very moment when it was in danger of expiring. Now, today we might assume that a typical Hamlet is colloquial, familiar, and down to earth. A prince, yes, but with the common touch. No one, however, assumed any such thing when Fechter dared to play the role that way. It was his performance that created the image of an approachable Hamlet. And consciously or not, that image has influenced performances ever since, including Ben Kingsley's emotionally vulnerable Hamlet for the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1975, Ben Wishaw's lovable waif-like Hamlet for the Old Vic in 2004, and the RSC's 2008 production, in which David Tennant casually wrapped himself up in a woolly cap, scruffy parka, and orange sweater. It is indisputable that many modern interpretations of Hamlet owe something, not everything, but something, to the legacy first bequeathed by the little-remembered actor Charles Fechter during the reign of Queen Victoria. But do actors and audiences today recognize that legacy's existence and its power over them? Two, adapting Shakespeare is the norm, not the exception. For me, one of the most fascinating aspects of Shakespeare performance history is that the first generation to do Shakespeare after Shakespeare, the Restoration, changed everything. Actresses, indoor proscenium theaters, painted scenery, interpolated music, and most radically of all, Shakespeare's plays were rewritten for performance. Nahum Tate in 1681 wrote A Happy Ending King Lear. Lear and Cordelia survive. And in Sir William Davenant's 1664 version of Macbeth, the role of Lady Macduff was enhanced to be a foil to Lady Macbeth. Great news for the first generation of English actresses, while audience members applauded the variety of dancing and music provided by the witches. And most popular of all was Davenant's and Dryden's version of The Tempest, 1667, which had not just new songs, but new characters. Prospero gained a second daughter, Dorinda, Caliban a twin sister, Sycorax, Ariel a companion, Milka, and Prospero looked after his ward, Hippolyto. Less than a third of Shakespeare's original text survived in the Restoration version, but audiences flocked to see it from the 1660s to the 1830s. Now, these adaptations of Shakespeare, far more radical than many today, elicited few complaints about tampering with Shakespeare's words. In fact, most of the complaints were about not rewriting Shakespeare. So Pepys went to see a production of Romeo and Juliet as Shakespeare wrote it. He was not impressed. The worst production, rather the worst play that I ever heard in my life, is what he wrote in his diary. And he was equally scathing about an unrevised Midsummer Night's Dream, which he called the most insipid, ridiculous play that ever I saw. So Restoration Shakespeare reminds us that earlier generations of audiences and actors did not believe that Shakespeare's words were sacrosanct. Restoration actors and theater managers, some of whom, like Davenant, had worked for Shakespeare's own company, the King's Men, before the theaters were closed in 1642, they believed, nonetheless, that Shakespeare's plays belong to the living theater and not to their dead author. 3, because Shakespeare is familiar, Shakespeare can be strange. The history of Shakespeare performance is familiar to us in one way because the plays and the characters feel so close. We know what happens. Romeo and Juliet die, Richard II loses his crown, Portia wins in the courtroom, right? We know the terrain. So when we learn about past performances, we bring some advanced knowledge to the process. But even a familiar play can become strange. Now, in Robert Falls's 1985 production of Hamlet at the Wisdom Bridge Theater in Chicago, Aidan Quinn played Hamlet as a rebel without a cause, who instead of speaking the line "to be or not to be," picked up a can of spray paint and wrote it letter by letter onto the stage wall. Now, this unexpected gesture was meant to convey Hamlet's frustration, right? Graffiti being the expressive form of choice for troubled youth. But in a reminder that every stage action contains layers of meaning, the spray-painted soliloquy also served as a meta-theatrical comment on the play's classic status. By not delivering the immortal line, Quinn signaled that "to be or not to be" had been uttered so many times by so many actors in so many theaters that it was just not possible to say it in a fresh way. The condition of postmodernity. Hamlet the play and Hamlet the character were exhausted. What could be done? Blending stage and page, the actor turned a line that the audience usually hears into a line that the audience now reads. The stage wall itself became a fragmentary text of Hamlet. Now, all this happened silently, except for the rattle of the can of white spray paint as each letter in each word of Shakespeare's immortal line took shape on the wall, squiggle by painted squiggle. Let me conclude with a plea for performance history. Even for those who research modern and contemporary performance, and even for those who perform Shakespeare today, historical consciousness is needed. Because only by studying history can we understand how things change, or identify the causes of change, or realize what has not changed. Without a grasp of history, we cannot understand how the present became the present. And if we do not understand the present, then we will not understand the future that it creates, the future we ourselves are creating right now. The need to understand the future is a very good reason to study the past, because as Faulkner said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Christie, if you would turn your camera and your mic back on, we have a couple of questions that we'll take. And I hope that people who are listening to us will use the Q&A link to send in some more questions. Thank you so much for both of you for outlining your books and the elements and what you think people should take away from reading them, which is really, I think, rich and exciting. One of the questions that has come in so far, I'd like actually to address to both of you, and it's from James Holman, who's saying that there's a moment right now coming out of the pandemic era, if we are coming out of it, and obviously we're all coming out of it in different rates, some way more slowly than others, about whether you think Shakespeare's works can be adapted again to a kind of contemporary circumstance. And whether you see performance trends that might work in that direction. And I know, Christie, since you've been thinking a lot about Lepage's work and seeing a lot of stuff of Lepage's take, which often has a kind of contemporary resonance. And Richard, I suppose, thinking about this is the chapter that was waiting to be written when we forced you to stop updating performance. Whether either of you would want to respond in a kind of future-oriented way to that kind of question.
Well, I'll say just a couple of words about the idea of the globe, because I was just speaking yesterday to a scholar in Italy who is working with the Italian version of the globe in Rome. And she was saying during the first lockdown, it was the only theater that was allowed to open. It had, a third of the capacity. There were 350 people as opposed to 1,000 people, but they were allowed to open, and none of the other theaters in the entire city were. So, and here in Stratford, they're building an outdoor theater as a result of not being able to have people inside. So I think there's going to be some interesting discussions about, well, I mean, people have already talked about, that Shakespeare wrote, King Lear in a lockdown. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but the idea that there was plague at the time. There are certainly resonances within the plays that we can certainly look at, but also that the playing space allows for that kind of, if not social distancing, at least an open air environment in which to discuss things. So I think that I think my answer is that yes, there is definitely a moment here, and that things may come back differently. The other thing I'd say is, I was talking with Tom Bird, who was the director of the Globe to Globe Festival, and he said that theaters are going to have to go back to first principles and figure out what it is they do and what we need them for, and not just assume that they have a right to life. So I think that's what we're going to be seeing. A lot of people going back to back to the drawing board about what it is we need theater for. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks. This is a moment to think about the restoration, because 1660 is the new 2021, right? Because 1660 theaters had been closed for 18 years. You think 14 months is something? Try 18 years. But the decision that the English theater had to face in 1660 is exactly parallel to what's going on now, which is, well, if we're going to restore the theater, what exactly are we going to restore? What are we going to keep? What are we going to let go? And what are we going to do differently? All these decisions had to be made in 1660. And the lesson from the restoration is the people who want to cling to how theater was done before the grand closure, the people who just want to reinstate theater as it had been, run out of steam quickly. This is 2021, like 1660, as Christie was saying, is an extraordinary moment to rethink from the ground up what theater is for, who it's for, and where it is. I think a lot of the Zoom theater, lockdown theater, whatever you want to call it, has brought communities together, including an event like this, that in a way we really didn't pay much attention to. in the age of just live theater. So there are lessons to be learned, and we've been here before. It's called the Restoration, and even better things came out on the other side.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, when you think about the history of modern theater and its incorporation of the media that were supposed to destroy it, like, audio broadcast, film, video, internet connections. I think it'll be really interesting. I mean, I for one, as the no doubt largely academic cast of our attendees probably would attest. I for one am, I will confess, not hugely looking forward to going back to in-person meetings. Like, I think this is actually a terrific way to conduct meetings. And I wouldn't be surprised. And I think, Richard, what you're saying is exactly right. I think that theater is going to have to figure out what this technology has meant for its future, rather than being a kind of 14-month interregnum in the kind of stolid progress of the same. And I think that's really a great observation. Paul Edmondson has a question for Richard. What are some of the productions you yourself have seen that most struck with you as being rich in their self-awareness of the play's own theatrical history?
Thank you, Paul. It's great to have you here. The Stratford Mafia is out in full force. I was thinking of, perhaps you saw the production as well, of Philip Deloyd's Pericles. This is at the National Theatre in 94, 95, but we're of an age where we could very well have seen that production. And this production, which I saw in preview, was, I think, notorious for having such a complicated set that the National Theatre had to cancel a preview, something they never do. And the critics went nuts because the set wasn't working. They had to cancel a preview to fix the set. And, there was a toing and froing in the press. And I thought, this is a fantastic moment, because this is the stage history of the romances, if you want to use that word. And a place like Pericles, which is the enormous investment in stage spectacle as a kind of through line in theater history. It doesn't come out of blockbuster musicals or D.W. Griffith's silent films. Those are just more recent manifestations of it. It comes out of a 19th century obsession, which looks back to a Restoration obsession, which is, let's do on the stage everything that we can do. Let us revel in the full power of the theatrical enterprise. And if something can be done on stage, then we will do it. There's a kind of unembarrassed verve to that production. And I thought that Philip Deloyd's production of Pericles really tapped in to this kind of history of spirited ambition in theatrical production.
Todd Barnes has asked a question that I think both of you could respond to, and maybe Christie first. He asks, he says he sees a connection to how you, Christie, discuss looking back at Lepage as a kind of important failure. And he wonders whether both of the panelists can think of other such important failures in their efficacy or in their critical retrospection. From the Restoration to Lepage, what does it mean? And how does it feel to engage in a historiography that chronicles important failures? And have there been important COVID virtual performance failures more recently? You want to start us off, Christie?
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. There are, what's exciting is just what Richard was describing, is that people have thrown everything at the technology, and some of it has worked extremely well and some of it hasn't worked at all. But it's amazing the speed with which people have adapted to this form of communication. And, I'm just thinking about staged, Michael Sheen and David Tennant doing a Zoom conversation over trying to rehearse a play, and they never get to rehearse the play, and it's all about the communication about the play. And then the second season is actually about an American version of their discussion. So, and then they talk about different people coming and taking their roles. And I know some people think it's very sort of navel gazing, but I do think it actually highlights an awful lot of the issues that are. at stake in terms of the difference between, the North American and the British, but also television and film actors. It really is, there are a lot of things that they're able to address. So I guess what I would ask, or what I would hope, is that things that people learn from each other. I guess what I was the work that I did on interculturalism before, moving into Shakespeare in performance. There are moments when I felt that the audience wasn't giving the concept on stage enough credit. And, I know that lots of people didn't like it, but the Troilus and Cressida that they did here in Stratford, which was with the Worcester Group and the RSC, and the Worcester Group were doing what the Worcester Group do, and they were mimicking in the indigenous speech patterns, and making fun of all kinds of things that we have learned from the indigenous people, and it was amusing if you understood the concept that they were going for, but a lot of people just walked out, didn't give it a second chance. So I think, that is an important failure that I think that was here. And I think there've been a number of those. Another one was called A Soldier for Every Son, and it was a retelling of the tales of the Aztec people, but it was done almost as if it were, an episode of EastEnders with, Glaswegian accents for the toughest chief. And there were just all these, these parallels were made, but they were just such stereotypes. So I think there've been some really good failures that people could learn from. And I think with the technology particularly, there are some spectacular innovations that have happened as well. So I really hope that all of those things will take us forward in a whole different way after the pandemic is finished. Well, if it ever is. Sorry, over to you, Richard.
So, thanks. I can hardly do better than that answer, Christie. Thank you. I was thinking about failure in a different way, which is where the text fails us, where the text seems unplayable in the 21st century. And I won't go on and on, but I'll just mention two moments that I think will be very well known to our audience. The ending of Taming of the Shrew. How do you make that work? And the ending of Measure for Measure. I mean, how do you justify that marriage? With Isabella, I mean, particularly in an age of Me Too. So I'm really interested in so in a way, it's a kind of question for our audience to take away with them. What do you do when the play itself, not a particular style, when the play itself really resists you and a moment in the show seems unplayable? What do you then do? Do you give up? Do we just stop doing Shakespeare, or do we find a way through it?
Great. I think we've got time for one very quick last question.
I'm going to slightly adapt, if I may, a question of Erica Lynn's, so she can be the Shakespeare of this moment and I the Nahum Tate. I'm curious if both of you would comment very briefly on the question of writing a short book. Robert Lepage, an extraordinary artist, an artist of a wide variety of approaches to a variety of media. And of course, Richard, a project that could have been 25 volumes. Were there a couple of principles that you had in mind that helped you to kind of focus in on doing something that would work extraordinarily well in both of your cases in this kind of a format?
I'll start if you don't mind. I'm just going to say that having these three other books come out, I could absolutely see the little bits that were missing, and the things that. Again, Lepage's work, I worked very closely. I was, in the rehearsals with him during my PhD. Then we went in opposite directions. Then it seemed like with him coming back to the Stratford Festival, that was coming back again to the same sort of position. So it was very much in the moment, but it also I made me think that there might be more to say here, and it was a great way of testing the waters and seeing what people think, whether there is enough interest to do something bigger or longer. Over to you.
Thanks, Christie. One of the difference between academic books and commercial books or trade books are that academic books serve the material, not the reader, and commercial books serve the reader, not the material. So in this book, I wrote it as if it were a commercial book. So I flipped it and I thought, what does the reader need or want at every point in the story? And then I drew upon the material to say what I wanted to say to the reader, rather than trying to be faithful and dutiful to the material. That's what the 25 volumes are for. So once I got my head around that, it was actually fun to write this book, which is not always true.
I think Emily is going to say a couple of final words here. I just want to thank both Richard and Christie for agreeing to do this, and Emily for organizing it. I see a number of familiar names of friends and familiar names who I have never met in person in our list of attendees. Thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions about this series, please feel free to email me. The link is in the chat. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks to Bill, Richard and Christie. It's been a brilliant discussion, and thanks to everyone for your questions. There were quite a few flying in at the end there, so sorry if we didn't get to yours. But as I said, we'll send round a recording of the session and also discounts for the print copies. But that's it for this afternoon. Thanks so much for attending.